Let's begin with the hook of the moment: a burning airport. An airport is not merely a piece of infrastructure, it is the gateway of a nation to the world. When the airport burns, it's not just buildings on fire, it is the collapse of the illusion of stability, the exposure of the system's vulnerability. The burning airport tells us that the war Netanyahu thought he could control has now entered a phase where control is an illusion. The very foundations of security, which Israeli leadership promised to its people, are crumbling before the cameras. The image of a burning airport is not simply a piece of breaking news, it is the kind of moment that history seizes upon to make its presence felt. When we hear that an airport has been reduced to flames, we must recognize that this is not just about collapsed terminals, shattered glass, or scorched runways. An airport, by its very essence, is the artery of a nation's connection to the world. It is a place where people arrive and depart, where commerce and diplomacy flow, where the image of a country is projected to the outside world. When an airport burns, the illusion of normalcy, of stability, of control is burned with it. It is the ultimate crack in the facade of security that governments promise and citizens are taught to believe. The flames leap higher not only in steel and concrete, but in the minds of millions watching, thinking, and suddenly questioning: if the airport can burn, what else can fall? Netanyahu and his government have long sold the story of Israel as a fortress, impregnable, shielded by its military might and its technological superiority. For decades, the world has been told that Israeli security is ironclad, that it has mastered control over its borders, its skies, and its enemies. But the burning airport tells us a different story. It whispers through the smoke that the fortress is not as unbreakable as it seems, that the promise of eternal dominance is nothing more than a political slogan, and slogans, no matter how loudly repeated, cannot withstand fire. The burning airport becomes the ultimate hook for global attention because it shows in one instant that power can be pierced, control can be lost, and leadership can be humiliated. Think of the symbolism. For years, Israel presented its airports as models of security: the tightest screening, the most advanced technology, the most disciplined protocols. They were showcases of strength, examples meant to tell the world, here, nothing gets through, here no weakness exists. And yet now, in a matter of hours, that showcase is turned inside out. The flames dancing across the tarmac are not just destroying planes and terminals, they are burning through decades of carefully crafted myth-making. They are pulling back the curtain on the reality of vulnerability that has always been there, but was hidden behind propaganda and public relations. The power of such an image lies in its ability to cut through official narratives. Leaders can issue statements, governments can deny weakness, and spokespeople can spin their stories, but a burning airport cannot be talked away. It cannot be hidden. The sight is too powerful, too visceral, too undeniable. Citizens see it and feel the shock. Allies abroad see it and quietly begin to wonder if the alliance is built on shaky ground. Enemies see it and feel emboldened, sensing that even giants bleed, even fortresses fall. The burning airport becomes not just an event, but a psychological turning point in the war of perception. And here lies the deeper point: the collapse of an airport is never just about logistics, it is about legitimacy. When a government promises that it can protect its people, secure its borders, and project strength, it ties its legitimacy to those claims. When those claims collapse in smoke and flame, legitimacy collapses alongside them. The people begin to doubt, the soldiers begin to question, the world begins to see through the cracks. Netanyahu's government built itself on the claim of strength. Now, the burning airport screams weakness so loudly that even his most loyal followers cannot avoid hearing it. The hook here is unavoidable. When the airport burns, it is not only the planes that fall from the sky, it is the myth of invulnerability that crashes to the ground. The flames are writing a new story on the canvas of history, one that Netanyahu and his allies cannot erase. Every picture, every video clip, every broadcast from that scene chips away at the edifice of power. And the lesson is not confined to Israel, it is universal. No matter how strong a state believes itself to be, no matter how untouchable its leaders imagine they are, One airport burning can show the world that the empire has cracks, that the giant has feet of clay, and that the future may belong not to those who boast the loudest of their power, but to those who endure and resist until the mask slips and the truth is revealed in fire. The image of a leader forced to flee is one of the most powerful and damning symbols in politics. When a man who has built his entire career on the narrative of strength, dominance, and control is suddenly seen running from the very chaos he claimed to master, the story shifts dramatically. Netanyahu, who has presented himself for decades as the guardian of Israel's security, the architect of its military power, and the defender of its people, is suddenly recast not as a figure of control, but as one of retreat. The hook here is irresistible. The man who promised safety is now seeking it for himself. This is not just a personal humiliation, it is a public unraveling of the myth he has worked so carefully to sustain. To understand the weight of such an event, we must consider the political image Netanyahu cultivated. He thrived on projecting fear into the hearts of Israel's enemies and confidence into the hearts of its citizens. He styled himself as the protector, the strongman who could stare down Iran, suppress resistance movements, and maintain Israel's dominance in the region. His political authority was tied to this identity, but when reports surface of Netanyahu fleeing under pressure, the very foundation of his authority is shaken. Leaders who run in moments of crisis do not inspire confidence, they inspire doubt. And in politics, doubt is often the beginning of collapse. There is a psychological shift that takes place when a leader flees. For his supporters, it raises a dangerous question: if the leader cannot stand firm, why should the people? For his opponents, it offers a surge of energy and morale. If the strongman runs, then perhaps he is not as strong as he claims. For the world watching from outside, the sight of Netanyahu's forced retreat sends an unmistakable message that his government is not unbreakable, that the cracks in his authority are now visible even to the naked eye. The hook is clear: one man running becomes an entire system stumbling. We must also acknowledge the historical resonance of such moments. Leaders who flee in times of war or national crisis often do not return with the same authority. They are marked by that act, remembered for their retreat rather than their victories. In the Middle East, where power is so often linked to perception, this kind of imagery is devastating. An airport burning is already a blow to national pride, but the leader fleeing from that same fire compounds the damage. It transforms an isolated event into a national crisis of confidence. Netanyahu's enemies know this, and his allies fear it. Both understand that this is more than a single act of self-preservation. It is a symbolic defeat broadcast to the world. What makes this even more striking is the contradiction at the heart of Netanyahu's leadership. For years, he told his people that only through him could Israel remain secure, that without his iron hand chaos would reign. Now, by fleeing, he has become the chaos he warned against. He has proven that fear does not protect, that military dominance cannot shield even its own architect. The strongman, when stripped of his mask, looks very much like a man running from the consequences of his own decisions. That hook is impossible to ignore because it punctures the very myth that sustained his political survival for so long. The forced flight of Netanyahu also ripples outward into international politics. Allies who once viewed him as a dependable partner may now reconsider the strength of his leadership. Rivals who feared his influence may now see an opportunity to push back harder. In global affairs, weakness is contagious. Once a leader is seen fleeing, the perception of instability spreads beyond national borders. The burning airport was the spark, but the fleeing leader is the accelerant, turning an isolated fire into a global narrative of collapse. The truth is that Netanyahu's flight is not merely about safety, it is about survival in a much deeper sense. His political survival depends on maintaining the image of a man who never blinks, never falters, never bends. By fleeing, he has broken that image in front of the cameras of the world. Once that image is broken, it cannot be easily repaired. And in the politics of perception, where strength and stability are currencies, Netanyahu's flight is the equivalent of bankruptcy. The hook remains unforgettable: when the leader runs, the system trembles, and history takes note of who stood and who fled. The collapse we are witnessing is not simply the failure of one man, one government, or one particular strategy. It is the failure of an entire doctrine that has dominated Israeli politics for decades. That doctrine is militarism, an unshakable belief that force alone can maintain order, expand influence, and silence opposition. It is the conviction that tanks, jets, and missiles can substitute for diplomacy, justice, and reconciliation. Yet today, as the flames spread and the world watches Netanyahu forced into retreat, we are reminded of an uncomfortable truth: militarism may win battles, but it cannot secure legitimacy, it cannot command loyalty, and it cannot create peace. The hook here is simple yet devastating. When the weapons speak louder than the people eventually rise louder than the weapons. For years, Israel has relied on the occupation of Palestinian lands, the blockade of Gaza, and the constant threat of military intervention across the region as the pillars of its security. These measures were sold to the public as necessary, as protective, as the only way to ensure survival in a hostile environment. But what we see now is the unraveling of that logic. The airport in flames is not an accident. It is the inevitable outcome of a strategy that mistakes dominance for stability. Occupation breeds resistance, and resistance finds ways to pierce even the strongest defenses. The idea that a nation can forever suppress another people without consequence has always been a dangerous illusion. Today's chaos exposes that illusion for all to see. Militarism fails not only because it generates enemies faster than it eliminates them, but because it corrodes the very society that relies on it. A state that prioritizes weapons over welfare, that invests more in bombs than in bridges, eventually weakens itself from within. The constant militarization of Israeli life has drained its democracy, divided its citizens, and left its leaders hostage to the next war. Netanyahu is not the first leader to discover that once you build your power on military dominance, you must continually escalate to maintain it. And escalation, by its nature, invites disaster. The hook is inescapable. A nation addicted to militarism eventually discovers that its greatest enemy is the addiction itself. Occupation, too, carries within it the seeds of failure. For generations, Palestinians have been told that their voices, their rights, and their aspirations do not matter. Walls were built, checkpoints enforced, homes demolished, and land seized under the assumption that power could erase memory. But memory does not die, it deepens. Resistance does not vanish, it adapts. Each new act of repression creates the conditions for the next uprising. The burning airport is not just a sign of military weakness, it is a symbol of moral bankruptcy. It tells us that no amount of force can erase the human demand for dignity, that no wall is high enough to contain the will of a people determined to live free. Militarism also fails because it isolates. Netanyahu has long believed that with American support, Israeli militarism could operate with impunity. Yet, as the world witnesses the fires of war spreading, as footage of destruction circulates across global screens, sympathy for militarized repression diminishes. Allies who once turned a blind eye are now pressured by their own citizens, their own parliaments, their own consciences. The facade of unshakable support begins to crack. Militarism, by its very nature, creates a zero-sum world, us versus them, security for some at the expense of security for others. But in today's interconnected world, such a model cannot last. The hook is powerful in seeking absolute control. Militarism ensures absolute isolation. The greatest irony is that the very militarism Netanyahu and his predecessors relied on to ensure Israel's survival may now hasten its decline. By refusing dialogue, by scorning compromise, by doubling down on occupation and blockades, they have guaranteed that conflict would not end but intensify. They built a house of power with walls of steel, but forgot that steel rusts, that fire melts, that people endure. The airport in flames, the leader fleeing, the people rising, these are not isolated images, but chapters in the story of militarism's failure. And so, the lesson presses itself upon us with urgency. You cannot occupy forever. You cannot bomb your way to peace. You cannot imprison generations and expect gratitude. Militarism promises control but delivers chaos. Occupation promises safety but breeds resistance. Netanyahu's retreat is not just his personal downfall, it is the echo of a deeper collapse, the sound of militarism cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. The hook that history drives home is unmistakable. Those who build power on violence will eventually be consumed by the violence they unleash. What is unfolding in the Middle East is not a local crisis that can be contained within its borders. It is a tremor that sends shockwaves across the global political landscape. The burning airport, the images of Netanyahu forced to flee, and the unraveling of Israel's militarized strategy are not events existing in isolation. They reverberate outward, reshaping alliances, testing the resolve of empires, and forcing uncomfortable questions on capitals from Washington to Brussels, from Riyadh to Tehran. The hook here is undeniable. When one of the most militarized states in the world is exposed in weakness, the entire architecture of global power begins to shake. For decades, Israel has been a cornerstone of Western influence in the Middle East, a regional proxy for U.S. strategy, and a partner in enforcing a balance of power tilted against resistance movements. This role depended on the perception of Israel as strong, stable, and unshakable. Now, with airports burning and its leader fleeing, that perception is collapsing. Washington, which has invested billions in military aid and political cover for Israel, suddenly faces the specter of its ally being seen not as an anchor of stability, but as a source of instability. The credibility of U.S. foreign policy is drawn into the fire because if its closest partner in the region falters, so too does the image of American power. The hook here cuts deep when Israel burns. Washington's reputation smolders alongside it. This crisis also alters the calculations of Israel's regional neighbors. Arab states that cautiously normalized relations under the Abraham Accords now find themselves facing domestic outrage as images of destruction circulate across their societies. Governments in the Gulf, which sought to reap economic and security benefits from quiet alignment with Israel, are suddenly confronted by the price of association with a state visibly unraveling. Every protest in the streets of Cairo, Amman, or Doha is a reminder that Israel's perceived vulnerability makes cooperation more costly, more fragile, and more politically explosive. Leaders who once thought normalization would secure them against regional turbulence may now feel that they have tied themselves to a sinking ship. The hook is sharp. Alliances built on the illusion of Israeli strength weaken when that illusion burns away. Meanwhile, Israel's adversaries interpret the crisis in their own way. For movements like Hezbollah, Hamas, or the Houthis, the burning airport is more than a tactical victory, it is proof that resistance yields results. It validates decades of struggle, offering a surge of morale and recruitment power. For Iran, it reinforces the argument that patience and persistence can outlast even the most heavily armed adversary. The images of Israeli vulnerability circulate not just regionally but globally, energizing resistance movements far beyond the Middle East. In this way, what begins as a local blaze becomes fuel for global opposition to Western-backed militarism. Europe, too, cannot escape the implications. European governments have often walked a fine line, supporting Israel diplomatically while balancing human rights concerns and their own domestic pressures. But when airports burn and leaders flee, silence becomes harder to maintain. Citizens demand answers, opposition parties seize on the moment, and governments are forced to reevaluate whether unwavering support for Israel remains sustainable. The destabilization of Israel does not simply shift dynamics in the Middle East, it reverberates into Europe's internal politics, testing unity within the EU and opening cracks in NATO's shared stance on the region. The global economic system also feels the tremors. Conflict in the Middle East has always threatened energy markets, trade routes, and investor confidence. Images of burning infrastructure immediately trigger fears of escalation, fears that the crisis could spill into shipping lanes or oil supply chains. Markets thrive on stability, war delivers the opposite. Every escalation in Israel reverberates in the price of oil, in the stock exchanges of London and New York, and in the boardrooms of multinational corporations. Here the hook is financial as much as political. Instability in Israel is instability in global markets, and no economy is immune. What makes this moment even more dangerous is the narrative war that accompanies it. In the age of digital media, images of Israeli weakness spread across the globe in seconds, reaching audiences that official statements cannot counter. Governments can try to control the story, but the story is already told in fire and smoke. For the oppressed, these images are a call to hope. For the powerful, they are a warning that dominance can be undone overnight. For the undecided, they are proof that no empire, no alliance, no leader is invulnerable. The hook here is in the immediacy. One burning airport becomes a global headline that reshapes public opinion across continents. In short, the crisis does not stay within Israel's borders, it reshapes the map of power far beyond. Allies grow nervous, adversaries grow confident, economies tremble, and the very image of Western backed militarism is set aflame. This is not just Israel's crisis, it is a test of the global order built upon its strength. The hook that history drives home is unmistakable. When a pillar of empire wavers, the entire structure begins to sway, and the world feels the tremor beneath its feet. The political image of Benjamin Netanyahu has always been carefully engineered, a brand built not on modesty or compromise, but on the projection of strength. For years, he has cultivated the persona of the unflinching statesman, the defender of Israel against its enemies, the man who could stare down threats and emerge unbroken. His speeches, his policies, his very tone have been crafted to instill the belief that he was the anchor of stability in a region of chaos. Yet, as events unfold with airports burning and Netanyahu forced into retreat, that image is collapsing in plain sight. The hook is undeniable. The man who spent decades convincing the world of his strength now embodies weakness, and the collapse of that image is perhaps more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The foundation of Netanyahu's power was never just military or political, it was psychological. His supporters believed he could not be shaken. His adversaries often calculated that he was too entrenched to be removed. International allies, especially in Washington, saw him as the indispensable partner, the one leader who could reliably deliver strength when others faltered. That perception gave him leverage far beyond what policy alone could secure. But perception is fragile, and once it cracks, it spreads like broken glass. The sight of Netanyahu fleeing, the stories of chaos under his leadership, are shattering the psychological stronghold he worked so hard to create. What was once seen as resilience now looks like desperation, and desperation is fatal to the image of a strongman. In politics, especially in the volatile Middle East, optics are often as powerful as reality. Netanyahu understood this better than anyone, which is why he built his career on performance as much as policy. Every public appearance, every tough line, every military strike was not only about the material effect, but about reinforcing the narrative that he alone could keep Israel secure. That narrative is unraveling. The burning airport, the rising chaos, and his visible retreat tell a different story, that his power is not absolute, that his control is slipping, that his promises ring hollow. The hook is piercing. When the performance fails, the myth collapses, and the audience sees the man behind the curtain. The consequences of this collapse reach beyond Netanyahu himself. For his supporters within Israel, the revelation is deeply unsettling. If the man they believed was the guarantor of security is now running from crisis, then the entire security doctrine comes into question. Doubt seeps into the public consciousness, and doubt is contagious. Once people begin to ask whether Netanyahu is as strong as he claims, they inevitably ask whether the system he represents is as strong as it claims. For his political rivals, this collapse is an opportunity to challenge him more aggressively, to expose the fragility of his leadership and offer alternatives. For his enemies abroad, it is a gift, proof that the symbol of Israeli strength is not untouchable. Netanyahu's image collapse also matters internationally. Leaders who once relied on his political durability to anchor their Middle Eastern strategy now face a dilemma. Can they continue to invest in a figure who looks less like a pillar of strength and more like a liability? Washington, which has long supported him despite global criticism, must now weigh whether his weakened image undermines U.S. credibility. The same applies to European partners who justified their alignment with Israel through Netanyahu's projection of stability. The hook here is clear. Once a leader is seen as vulnerable, the alliances built around his strength become unstable as well. Perhaps the most striking element of this collapse is the irony it contains. Netanyahu's entire career was built on the promise of security, yet his leadership has delivered the opposite. The stronger he claimed to be, the more glaring his weakness now appears. The louder he projected invulnerability, the more humiliating his retreat becomes. He has fallen victim to his own narrative, trapped in the persona of strength he created. When that persona breaks, there is nothing left to shield him. The man who told his people that he could not be replaced now looks like the weakest link in the chain. The hook cuts deep when strength is revealed as illusion. The illusionist has nothing left to sell. This unraveling is not just personal, it is systemic. Netanyahu embodied the idea of Israel as an unshakable fortress, and his collapse reflects back onto the nation's image. His downfall is more than a personal humiliation, it is a symbolic weakening of the very edifice he claimed to represent. Leaders can survive scandals, corruption charges, even defeats, but they rarely survive the loss of their image. In politics, once strength is seen as weakness, the curtain has fallen, the play is over, and the audience will not believe the performance again. Netanyahu's collapse is therefore not only the end of a man's myth, but potentially the beginning of a deeper reckoning for the system that relied on that myth. The hook is unforgettable when the strongman crumbles. The empire he carried on his shoulders trembles with him. Moments arrive in history when events do not simply follow one another but break the chain, tearing open a new path, forcing societies and nations to confront realities they can no longer ignore. The burning airport and Netanyahu's flight are not just episodes of crisis, they are signals of such a turning point. They carry the weight of rupture, the sense that what comes after will not look like what came before. These images are not fleeting. They are markers etched into the collective consciousness that announce the end of one era and the uncertain, turbulent birth of another. The hook that grabs us is this: when leaders run and institutions crumble, history itself changes direction. The fire consuming that airport is more than destruction, it is a metaphor for the unraveling of illusions. For decades, the story of Israel's unshakable dominance has been repeated until it felt like fact. Netanyahu embodied that myth, presenting himself as the guarantor of continuity and control. But myths burn quickly when touched by reality, and this one is reduced to ash in front of the world. The flames tell us that the future cannot be governed by the same narratives that dominated the past. Something new must emerge, and that something will not be built on the same promises of invincibility and control. The hook here is stark. The fire is not just an ending, it is the ignition of a new chapter whose consequences no one can yet fully predict. Turning points in history are defined not only by the collapse of old structures but by the empowerment of those long suppressed beneath them. The people of Palestine, long silenced, long marginalized, long told that resistance was futile, are suddenly confronted with proof that the edifice of occupation can crack. The sight of Israeli weakness becomes more than a symbol, it becomes a possibility. The oppressed see in Netanyahu's retreat the validation of their endurance, the suggestion that decades of struggle were not in vain. For those who have carried the weight of hopelessness, such moments are transformative. The hook is powerful. When the powerful stumble, the powerless discover their strength. But turning points also ripple outward, challenging global systems of power. The United States, which has tied its Middle Eastern strategy to the image of Israel as an unbreakable partner, must now confront the fragility of that bet. European nations, already strained by internal divisions, face renewed pressure from citizens who refuse to accept blind support for policies that breed instability. Arab regimes that aligned with Israel for economic or strategic gains must now calculate whether the cost of association has become greater than the benefits. The very structure of alliances built over decades begins to wobble when one of its central pillars is exposed. The hook here is global. When one ally falters, the empire trembles. What makes this moment even more significant is that it is happening in an age of instant visibility. In the past, governments could hide defeats, spin narratives, and control the story. Today, however, every image of the burning airport, every rumor of Netanyahu's flight, every video uploaded to social media spreads in seconds across the world. This means the turning point cannot be contained. It cannot be hidden behind diplomatic statements or official denials. The people, both within Israel and outside it, see the weakness for themselves. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. The hook lies in the immediacy. When weakness is broadcast live, history accelerates, moving faster than leaders can control. The deeper shift here is not only political but psychological. For decades, fear was the instrument by which Israel, under Netanyahu and his predecessors, maintained dominance, fear of its military, fear of its retaliation, fear of its alliances. But fear is fragile when it collides with visible vulnerability. The moment that fear collapses, the balance of power shifts in unpredictable ways. Resistance movements become bolder, allies become hesitant, and ordinary citizens begin to imagine alternatives to the status quo. The hook is this: fear can control for decades, but when it evaporates, it disappears in an instant. What we are witnessing, therefore, is not a minor crisis, but a historical pivot. Netanyahu's forced retreat, the burning of an airport, the cracks in the illusion of invincibility, these are not isolated moments. They are signposts pointing to a new reality in which old assumptions no longer hold. The world is being asked to rethink what stability means, who holds power, and how long militarism can substitute for legitimacy. The hook that keeps echoing is unrelenting. History does not move in straight lines, it bends sharply in moments like this, and once bent, it never returns to its old shape. Let me close with this thought: moments like these are not accidents. They are the culmination of choices, of systems built on inequality and violence. Netanyahu fleeing is not the end of the story, it is a turning point. What comes next depends on whether we, the global community, have the courage to learn, to act, and to stand with those who have resisted for generations. History is calling us, and the smoke rising from that airport is the signal fire. We cannot look away. Thank you.